Hi, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you all today on the concept of fair trade and the new international economic order. So, the fair trade movement is in a period of deep reflection. It is also, perhaps one can say, in a point of crisis. Ever since the 1990s, the fair trade movement, until very recently, was considered as an exemplary commercial success story. Proof that if given the decision, consumers would be willing and happy to pay more for an ethical cup of coffee, for example, than to be complicit in the continued exploitation of primary producers in the global south. There was a decision that was made sometime during the 1990s, at the height of the ethical consumption era, for the subcultural, progressive, and alternative trade movement, which evolved, for example, to circumvent Reagan's sanctions against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or to aid the broader movement trying to overthrow apartheid in South Africa. Well, there was an attempt to evolve this into a fair trade. The idea was that although alternative trade was coupled with the politics of third world liberation, it now needed to be the case that fair trade products should be in every supermarket, not just to be consumed by progressives who go out of their way to acquire them. Ethical consumption could change the world and provide reprieve for farmers worried about bread and butter in a new unipolar world. The idea was that it shouldn't have just been those producers who were lucky enough to be involved with the alternative trade movement that benefit. And it shouldn't only just be those consumers of third world liberation shops somewhere in Greater London, for example, who could aid in the effort to develop a shadow ethical economic system. The idea with fair trade certification was that far more producers of primary commodities in the global south should earn a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, plus a premium, which they could use at their own behest to uplift their own communities. If this meant partnerships with corporations who had, until that moment, derided fair trade, then so be it. For a long time, this worked to the extent that it brought fair trade into the mainstream. And though the anti colonial ethos of the fair trade movement receded into the background, it was still best embodied in the symbolism of the first certification, that of Max Havelaar, Coffee in 1988 in the Netherlands, itself based on an anti colonial novel published in 1860 about how colonial terms of trade forced the Javanese to produce sugar and coffee for the masters of their country in the Netherlands instead of rice for themselves. The fair trade movement made peace with large conglomerates like Sainsbury's and Tesco and even Nestle. And this is how it grew into the juggernaut movement that it is today, with over 1.66 million farmers in 1,411 producer organizations across the world. The problem, however, is that now these very corporate partners have decided to go at it alone, developing their own certifications, abandoning fair trade, for example, for fairly traded products. Mondelez now has Cocoa Life, Nestle has Cocoa Plan, Starbucks has cafe practices, etc. Writing for The Guardian, Subramanian argues that these corporations bring this in-house in order to use fair trade for their own purposes. We are extremely concerned about the power and control that Sainsbury's seeks to exert over us, which actually feels reminiscent of colonial rule. These were the words that were used by some farmers who were responding to the recent news that now they would have to answer to a board in London and justify the use of their own well earned premium. And all of a sudden, now we are back to square one. The decisions of farmers in the periphery are decided by board members, some metropolises in the former colonial core. Max Havelaar has lost the battle, but not the war. In a sense, the story of fair trade is intimately tied to the story of a world premised on the principle of free trade, which actually has historically masked the truth of globalization, which was secured through the divvying up of land and labor by Europe, the United States, the Ottomans, and Japan. In this sense, fair trade was expressly anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, a response to the imperialism of free trade. The name itself meant that free trade was a freedom for the powerful to exploit the poor, for the colonizers to exploit the colonized. For the subjects of imperialism, they were doubly free, free to submit or free to be thrown in concentration camps. Free trade was not fair. To not put forward a definitive typology on the origins of the fair trade movement, because I know that the story of where it began is contested, I'd like to propose three types of stories. The first story is a story of ethical circumvention. For example, one story begins with Edna Ruth Tyler, of the Mennonite Central Committee in 1942, importing needlecrafts from low-income women in Puerto Rico, a colony of the United States, to be sold in charity stores and ethnic shops across America. To get around or to circumvent a system of colonialism which relied on the hyper-exploitation of Puerto Ricans, Byler set up 10,000 villages. And then there's a type of a second kind of story, which sees fair trade as perhaps peripheral to broader processes of social transformation in an era of decolonization. Here, fair trade becomes an ethos inspired, for example, by the 1968 UNCTAD Conference on Aid and Development, where the Global South coalesced into one bloc in the UN General Assembly, representing the global majority as the Group of 77, demanding a new world built on, and this was the slogan, open quote, trade, not aid. And I'm personally quite partial to a third kind of story. And what I would like to submit today is that it shouldn't only be an origin story, but a guide for the future. That is the fusion of these two types of stories. Ethical circumvention as part and parcel of a process of systematic transformation. Now, that is a mouthful, I know, but hopefully it's the future. Let me put it simply. We do not passively buy ethical products to ease our conscience. We know that fair trade products contribute to a very tangible and ecologically just transition to a new economy. That's the principle that I think is a combination of ethical circumvention and systemic transformation. So, for example, the Quaker Free Produce Society in 1826 is like an instance of this, and which is when a specific segment of the Quaker Church built a movement to consciously source goods that were not produced by slave labor. This act of boycotting would have been nothing if it was an end in and of itself. But the Quakers in the US knew that ethical consumption needed to be part and parcel of a broader abolitionist movement, one intimately tied with the Underground Railroad and the movement to abolish slavery. It wasn't just that they were putting their money where their mouths were. They were also using their voices to overthrow the system of slavery. They circumvented the system of slavery, sure, but they also sought to abolish it. If you have a project of circumvention without political action, then you tolerate exploitation outside of the markets you interact with. They're happening over there. I'm buying ethically. But if you have a product of systematic transformation without ethical action, you fail to demonstrate that you can answer the problems of working people struggling in the here and now, basically promising them a new Eden, a new paradise. The project of fair trade actually has to be both. It has to be ethical and political, seeking to create a world where fair trade eventually abolishes itself, just as the Quakers led the way prior. Today, we talk about a just transition, but once upon a time, there was talk of a new international economic order. That's what I'd like to explore today. What I'm proposing isn't necessarily a new idea. In fact, it's an old one. There was a time when people fought for fair trade to be one component of a broader project trying to conceive of a new international economic order. Even though many historians see the project as a failure, the fact that we can discuss it today is proof that this specter has not been exercised. For fair trade to realize its highest aspirations, it should openly and expressly advocate for supranational regulation over the supply chains of the world. It should openly and expressly advocate for supranational regulation over tax havens, supranational regulation over corporate power. If fair trade is now undergoing an unamicable divorce with the corporate world, well, it's only fair that the movement goes back to its roots and tries to rein corporate power in. That is, if fair trade would like to be true to itself. Fair trade can no longer survive if it concedes to Thatcher's two dictums. The first being that ethical consumption makes sense, because there is no society, obviously, and only families and individuals. And the second, that families and individuals can only express their own personhood, not through solidarity with faraway societies, of course, they don't exist, but through individual consumption. After all, as Margaret Thatcher put it in another instance, there is no alternative. The world that captured even the imagination of New Labour has now broken down. So we saw this world burn down in protests in Lebanon, Haiti, Chile, and even in the Enough is Enough campaign right here in Britain. The global pandemic and the vaccine apartheid that it revealed, and now the impending ecological catastrophe that awaits us, are proving to us all that global problems require global solutions. Neoliberalism was not the only alternative to the crises of the 1970s. And if we resurrect other proposed global projects for the post-colonial, post-war order, perhaps we can give fair trade new purpose. The new international economic order was one proposition to overcome the structural crises of the global economy in the 1970s. And if you haven't heard about it, there's a reason for that. So what was it? To put it very straightforwardly, the new international economic order was a UN declaration approved by the General Assembly in 1974, which stated that in order to overcome, and this I quote directly from the document, the remaining vestiges of alien and colonial domination, foreign occupation, racial discrimination, apartheid, and neocolonialism, close quote, the global community should recognize that the New World Order, after decolonization, could not be premised on the pillar that the developing countries, which constitute 70% of the world's population, account for only 30% of the world's income. This was, after all, a time of incredible hope. With decolonization, it was hoped that the UN General Assembly could develop enough legislative power to correct colonial power imbalances on the world stage. With one member, one vote, the UN went from its inception after the war from having 51 member states to by 1962 having 110, most of which were new nations that had won their independence from the colonial powers through either protracted negotiations or protracted armed struggle. At the second UNCTAD conference in 1968, the very same conference which inspired fair trade, 77 member states coalesced to forge the G77, all of whom worked together over the years to draw the contours of the new international economic order. The foundation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions proved that multilateral governance was possible. The rapid but yet incomplete decolonization process meant that new voices could change the global agenda. The Marshall Plan, Soviet aid, and reparations to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust proved that resources could be transferred across the world, from rich countries like the United States to the destroyed metropolises, Tokyo and Berlin. It meant that the richer countries could, in principle, accept their responsibility to aid the poorer countries. Reparatory justice had enshrined itself as a principle of international law, and the OPEC oil embargo proved that resource-rich former colonies could bring Europeans to heel. The fiery new leaders of the post-colonial world had started to even envision the UN as a kind of shop floor of the world. In 1966, the Senegalese Foreign Minister Doudou Thiam took to the podium of the UN General Assembly to rally his equals. Open quote, he said, "For a long time prior to their independence, the developing countries had been seduced by the idea of the class struggle. But today they realize that the essential problem for them was the elimination not so much of the proletarian classes as of the proletarian nations," close quote. Echoing a similar sentiment, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania argued that the UN should be a trade union of the poor. Inspired by the OPEC embargo, he even argued that if the rich countries don't listen, maybe the poor countries could actually go on strike. Now, UNCTAD, a UN agency headed by the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, was proof of cataclysmic changes. Its mandate was, at the time, premised on the Prebisch-Singer thesis, which stated that absent regulatory intervention, there would be a deterioration of the terms of trade between primary commodity producer countries and manufacturers. And this would forever mean that if there weren't changes to the global economy, poor, formerly colonized countries, which produce primary commodities like cocoa or sugar, would never be able to develop. International trade needed to be managed, and there needed to be the transfer of resources from richer countries to poorer countries. So, for example, farmers in the primary commodity producer countries wouldn't need a fair trade movement to defend themselves from unscrupulous multinational corporations who seek to take advantage of economic imbalances that were forged during the colonial period. I think all of these political and economic circumstances and the creative ideas to address them laid the groundwork for Houari Boumediene, the leader of Algeria's address in April 1974, declaring the new international economic order to the UN. And what was it that he called for? He called for developing companies he called for developing countries to seize control of their natural resources, for multinational corporations to be expropriated if they break the law, for commodity export prices to be fixed, for cartels to be substituted, for cartels to substitute the market, for the world monetary system to be reformed, and for the UN to even create a special fund to serve the world's desperate people with food. And as the OPEC embargo, which successfully even forced some European countries to admonish Israel for the Yom Kippur War, after the Yom Kippur War, the G77 would go on strike to ensure this would happen. So it's not difficult to see how this level of daring to reimagine the global economy aided the fair trade movement. The fair trade movement wasn't just a consumer movement, it was a flank of a broader transformative process, which was trying to enshrine fair trade into international law. Even the United States didn't know what to do. Kissinger, for example, promised to have discussions on the creation of a supranational authority that would regulate commodity prices, like for primary commodities like bauxite, tin, and copper. He promised to expand U.S. food production and build a fund for the poorest countries. He confided to President Gerald Ford that the theology about the merits of the free market economy won't work to divide the G77. Food, he thought, could even wean countries like India away from the Soviet Union. In another memo, he said, and I quote, "We have to avoid an international dispute where Americans say the existing system is great and the lower developed countries call for a new economic order. This is a losing wicket," close quote. The basic strategy, he said, open quote again, must be to hold the industrialized powers behind us and to split the third world. The goal, he said, was to pull the new international economic order's teeth and divide these countries up. And certainly that happened. What we saw was the triumph of neoliberalism, the triumph of structural adjustment programs, the triumph of the Washington Consensus. A new international economic order never came into being. But what's the point of bringing all of this up? What does it have to do with fair trade? Well, on the one side, the new international economic order demonstrated a kind of enthusiasm of supranational multilateral governance that seems remote from the kind of glorification of small peasant communities that the alternative trade movement sought to champion in the decades to come. But there was a time when the two projects saw themselves as doing the same thing. So, for example, as Matthew Anderson, who we're lucky to have with us today, but in his magisterial history of the fair trade movement in Britain demonstrates, the Trade Union Committee for International Cooperation, formed in 1976, sought to bring together the fair trade movement and the trade union movements. And open quote, they said in their own founding document, they were doing this to, again, open quote, to increase the solidarity of all workers in support of the objectives of a new international economic order, close quote. In fact, when organizations like the TUC were reluctant to support, for instance, tea workers exploited by British corporations in Sri Lanka for economic nationalist reasons, it was a fair trade movement which carried the mantle of international unionism. Oxfam and other pioneers of the movement debated extensively on how the emerging alternative trade movement could help build up a new international economic order. They supported even, for example, the Brandt Report to the UN, which argued in 1980 that the main goals of the NIEO needed to be established for global welfare to triumph. And also, more importantly, when in 1984, the Greater London Council, then under the leadership of Ken Livingstone, established the Third World Project, a central element of that project was the Fair Trade Twin Trading Company. It wasn't just about easing the conscience of their consumers. In the founding document of this alternative trading company, which Margaret Thatcher was so alarmed by that she derided it as Ken Livingstone's primary apparatus for his foreign policy, they argued that the purpose of the company wasn't just to sell fair trade products, but as an innovative program bringing fair trade, labor, and the trade union movement together, open quote, in transferring technology to work in the third world, close quote, which is a key demand of the new International Economic Order document, declaration. And Twin Trading actually sourced gold for wedding rings, brewing the anti-apartheid symbol for cigars from Nicaragua and metals and textiles from Cuba. So where are we then today? In far too many ways, the new international economic order is outdated. For example, whereas 30% of the world's population, who are developing countries, own 70% of the world's wealth, that has now almost reversed. Some IMF estimates put 59% of the world's GDP in the hands of emerging markets. India, just 2 weeks ago, surpassed Britain in size as an economy. To quote a report from the Transnational Institute, in 2000, when Beijing launched its official going out policy, Chinese outbound foreign direct investment was just $2.3 billion. In 2018-19, it was $129 billion, taking the total stock from 27.8 billion to 1.94 trillion. Today, of the Fortune 500 list of the world's largest companies, 119 are Chinese, just behind the United States. And even though inequality between the developing countries and colonizers has been bridged to a degree, global income inequality has not, demonstrating that, as it turns out, proletarian classes might be a better vocabulary than proletarian nations for understanding the 21st century world. The global top 10% of the world's population owns 76% of total household wealth, captures 52% of total income in 2021. The global bottom 50% owns only 2% of global wealth at purchasing power parity. This has led even the World Economic Forum to admit that while over the last 2 decades, global inequalities between countries have declined, income inequality has increased within most countries. Let's put this in another way. As for the transnational capitalist class, which shoves its money in tax havens across the world, it has become more diverse. Many of its members are the millionaire and billionaire children of those very elites from the global majority who were once calling for a new international economic order in the mid 1970s. A worry and potential problem that thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, and Walter Rodney all warned us about. And it actually required a historic Faustian bargain. It required the very people who were calling for a new international economic order to now reject it and give in to global neoliberalism because they and their families and close circles could benefit from it. And I think in these times of ecological catastrophes, it's of course also important to talk about the fact that the right to the full exploitation of the resources of one country's is not only archaic in language, it might even be archaic in framing. But the new international economic order, which both imploded and exploded, still can provide a guiding light for the fair trade movement. We need still to rein in the power of global corporations. We need still to ensure that massive wealth transfers happen not from the rich countries to the poor countries, but from the rich people of the world to the poor people of the world. And we need to ensure that the world becomes more global and less parochial. Otherwise, fair trade will lose to the big corporations who use the symbol and certification until they could dispense of it when convenient, a process which is happening right before our very eyes. So where next? Well, maybe we could start having conversations with groups like the Tax Justice Network or the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, with the progressive sectors of the United Nations. Whatever that case may be, fair trade must return to its roots, or I fear that it shall perish. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited to see the questions. Thank you.